Welcome to Christendom Conversations. Together we'll explore the wisdom of the Catholic intellectual tradition, engage with thought-provoking ideas, and uncover deep insights into the perennial questions. We're thrilled to have you with us. Let's dive into today's conversation. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Andrew Whitmore today for a conversation. Professor Whitmore is a professor of theology here at Christendom College and also our academic dean. Thank you for all of your work in those areas. Before we get started, maybe you could say a bit about your background, your personal journey, your intellectual journey. So where have you come from and how did you come here?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I grew up in New England, so I came from a really small town in Massachusetts, and I stayed up there for undergraduate and actually didn't plan to go into theology at all. I wasn't exposed to it. I went to public schools, practiced the faith. I'm a cradle Catholic, but it wasn't even on my radar. So I think I went in looking to do like architecture or something. But when I got to my undergraduate, Assumption College, now university, we had to take certain classes in theology, and that's where I really fell in love with the scriptures, and I just couldn't put it down, and I switched from my English major at the time to a theology major. But then I made my way down to Washington, D.C., did my graduate studies, master's and Ph.D. at the Catholic University, focusing on moral theology, specifically St. Thomas Aquinas' virtue ethics, his virtue theory, and wrote my dissertation on that, and basically the inner mechanics of how you grow in virtue.
Right.
And then from there, got married, stayed around the D.C. area, but you can't stay around there too long, right? And,
Right.
There's this position that I'd heard of Christendom College while I was in grad school, and I met many people there, and I was always thought, what a great school. And a job opening opened there, and it was specifically to teach Thomistic moral theology. I thought, man, I better get an interview there. And it all worked out that
Sure.
I got the job.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, and you recently published a book, which I have here, called Saintly Habits. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. This is really the fruit of my research for the dissertation. The dissertation, of course, is going into a lot of the complexity of how Aquinas understands the differences between things like a disposition and a habit, and what this means for growing in virtue. What do these terms really mean? Because when we hear habit today, we think like biting your fingernails or
Smoking.
Yeah, smoking, things like that. So it's quite technical. And my passion has always been to communicate these things to other people. I guess that's why I became a professor. But I'd always had in the back of my mind figures like C.S. Lewis and them who take these complex ideas and can boil it down, make it understandable to everyone. And at first I was going to pursue an academic publication for my dissertation, and I switched ideas based off of conversations I had with people and decided let's make it a popular book. And so the idea behind it is it's all everything I studied, but organized according to 7 different strategies for growing in virtue. And each chapter gives you a different strategy, but also explains a different dimension of virtue along the way. So by the end, you've got 7 different strategies and a comprehensive understanding of virtue, at least Thomas's virtue theory.
Yeah, that's great. And say a bit about your course, because there's a course that Christendom is produced and will be available based on this book and your experience. Can you say a bit about that? What's it called? Becoming a Saint, I think. Is that? Yeah.
Becoming a Saint.
Yeah, okay.
So along the same ideas of the book's called Saintly Habits.
Right.
How can we now present this same sort of idea, growing in virtue, the difficulties of pursuing virtue in our culture today? A lot of people are concerned with themselves. How is it that I can navigate this world and growing in virtue? But also, we're concerned for our children, our grandchildren, keeping the faith, not losing it, in a world where maybe the virtues that presented are false virtues, or maybe they don't consider virtues at all. How do we properly understand it? And then what can I do to actually cultivate that virtue in my own life? And so the course is also set up according to these different strategies and different aspects. Not quite in the same way that they're presented in the book, but similar theme.
So there's a kind of theological, philosophical background, but it's also it's designed to help us grow in virtue.
Exactly. Practical, evangelical. How can I employ this, and how can I help other people as well?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the elephant in the room is really, what is a virtue? So, sometimes we think about it, from some perspectives, there's just one thing called virtue, but then they're different. You hear almost in another extreme, there are 1,000 different kinds of virtues. So maybe we could begin by clarifying the question: what is it? What are the types?
Yeah, there's so many different, and I specify that I studied Thomas's virtue theory, but there are many different virtue theories,
Right.
and Thomas would be drawing on people like Aristotle and Plato, but Aristotle doesn't present it the same way that Plato does. Thomas is drawing on Augustine. Even he and Augustine disagree on certain things. So, and then after the time of Aquinas, there are other virtue theories. But in general, I would say to just boil it down to its simplest concept, virtue is a good character trait. We're really speaking about not things. Sometimes the way we speak about virtues, we'll say like, oh, do I have courage, or does he have prudence, or does she have temperance? It's almost like these things, and we get this idea, I need to collect them all. But really, it's more appropriate to say she is prudent or he is temperate. It's a description of who we are. Aristotle will call it a second nature. And we have this second nature that we've cultivated on top of our nature that we're given by God and our parents. And but it's important that it's not just, we have this word habit. We can talk more about that. But it's not just a habit of doing good, but a habit of doing good that also makes you good. Because there are all sorts of ways that you can do good things that they don't really make you a good person. Right. The life of virtue, I always say that's the full flowering of the moral life. That we know we have this tendency to think of morality as just rules and following rules, and that's necessary. Rules can be good, but they're a good starting point. There's a lot that's not legislated. There's a lot. You can follow the rules and still be a jerk, but we wouldn't call you virtuous if you're a jerk, right? So there's all that full true dynamism and creativity that goes beyond just following the laws. It's in the spirit of the laws, but really shows the full freedom of an excellent human being.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Yeah, I'd love, if we have time, I'd like to talk more about habit versus sort of habitus and exis and all of those things, but we'll see if we have time. I am interested in sort of positioning your work in relation to a broader history, I guess. I haven't studied the history of virtue ethics, but there was a time where we thought primarily in terms of how to live with respect to rules or laws, and then there seems to be this rebirth of an orientation toward ethics. In terms of people that sort of the greats that I think of Anscombe, sort of. I think of Pieper. I think of MacIntyre. How does your work relate to the work that they've done in those areas?
Sure, I would say heavily influenced by MacIntyre. Father Pincair's would be the biggest inspiration there. And so you had, very interesting. I guess to go back a little bit historically, you have this idea of eudaimonia in the ancient world, and that carries throughout the tradition of the church. In the Old Testament with the Hebrews, you see certainly rule-based, the old law, but I think God in his divine pedagogy is trying to bring them to that more interior understanding of morality. So just in human history in general, I think there's been an ebb and flow on what's emphasized, virtue as opposed to law. Yeah. Now, again, they're not opposed to each other, but in the more immediate context, you had in kind of the modern period, a shift in the church toward rules. And there were certain practical reasons for why that happened. But by the time we get to the Second Vatican Council, there's this acknowledgement that kind of our morality has become deficient. Somehow we've dissociated it from spirituality. So we can have a moral handbook that's talking about rules, but has nothing to say about the sacramental life or grace or the theological virtues. So something seems to be missing. So the Vatican Council called for this renewal of moral theology to take the best teachings of morality throughout all ages of the church, to link them back up with Scripture and the patristics. And that's really, I think, what comes after the council, these figures like Father Pincair's writing in Europe and MacIntyre over here. So we have this revitalization of moral theology, and I just see my work as falling there. Kind of what Pincair's was doing was helping us to get the framework right again. And now how do we get into the more specifics, the particularities of it? So there's some authors writing on the Beatitudes, some on the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and here I'm looking at more of the inner mechanics of how does virtue actually develop.
Yeah. Could we drill in a little bit about how we got into a rules orientation? You mentioned sort of there was a reason that it went that way. Mm-hmm. Can you say a bit more historically about why that happened?
Yeah, I think there are philosophical reasons and there are practical reasons as well. Philosophically, part of the reason was we had this, I think even Pincair's calls it almost like a Copernican revolution or like an atom bomb explosion, really, where fundamentally God is simple in his being. So not simple for us to understand, right? But simple in his essence, meaning that he's just perfectly one, and all of his different attributes are one. So his wisdom is his love is his justice is his mercy, all these different things. But nevertheless, we need to speak about him. as humans. And so to speak about them, we have to break down these different attributes, and we can recognize a logical coherence to them, or even a logical priority to them. And classically, in Christianity, we've said, well, even though God's intellect and will are one and the same, there's a logical priority of his intellect to his will. Or in other words, what God wills is reasonable. It's intelligible. We can make sense of it. That's the whole basis for theology. That's not the way that every religion thinks, right? There are certain religions that we would call them voluntaristic. So that voluntas is the Latin word for will.
Right.
So they're more of a will-based. They have a primacy of will over intellect. So they would say that, God can do anything. Maybe he can even work a contradiction. Now, where does that come into morality? Well, we would say that when God gives us the Ten Commandments, for example, that's clearly an act of his will, but is it an act of his will logically preceding his intellect or following the intellect? So you could put it this way: thou shalt not murder. Is murder wrong because God said so, or did God tell us murder is wrong because that's, in fact, the case? And the tradition of Catholicism would say it's the latter, that God developing our nature, giving us a human nature, knowing our nature better than we know it ourselves, he knows that he's made us for certain ends, the ultimate end of union with him, but all these other goods along the way, some of them being we're inclined toward community, we're inclined toward seeking truth and helping one another, giving of ourselves as a gift toward a neighbor. And none of that's achievable if we're killing each other and going around worrying about people killing us. So God knows this about our nature, so he says, hey, don't kill each other. Sometimes I refer to the Ten Commandments as the divine cheat sheet. We could have figured these things out by reflecting on our nature, but he gave us a little push and a nudge in the right direction. So anyway, what happens after the time of Aquinas is that you have a shift in this understanding, that it's not his intellect logically precedes his will, but his will precedes his intellect or his reason. So at that point, it becomes voluntaristic. Murder is only wrong because God said so. And he could change his mind, or he could say it's only wrong for certain people and not others. It kind of opens up this whole can of worms. So at that point, if I can't reason through why these things are good or evil, because really that's what good or evil is, it's what's in accordance with human nature and what's not in accordance with human nature. But if I can't reason through that, then all I have to fall back on is what's legislated.
Right.
The only way I can learn what's right or wrong is by figuring out what the rules are.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I know who some of those culprits are, but we're not going to name names.
Sure.
So, that's thank you. As a historian myself, I always appreciate the background on this, and that is an interesting story to tell. Could you maybe clarify the different types of virtue? Because I think that might be helpful also before we go deeper into some of these other topics.
Yeah, helpful, also a little bit controversial too when you get into this field.
You're putting your reputation on the line right here. So
some of these figures that did have that shift in the understanding would also say, oh, some of these virtues are just needless repetitions of what actually exists.
We got a razor maybe to...
Yeah, exactly. So Occam, Duns Scotus. I said we won't name names.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, so I guess following the Thomistic line of reasoning here, Aquinas will make a fundamental distinction between acquired virtue and infused virtue. So by acquired virtue, the way he distinguishes them is according to their end, but also according to the way that they're attained. So first we can distinguish them by end. We can just say in the human person, we're made for God, but we also have a human nature, and there gets into this whole debate over nature and grace that we could spend probably weeks.
That's my next question, actually. So we can save that for
nice, easy one. Yeah. What's the relationship between nature and grace? Well, how is it that we can be made for God, but somehow we can't attain God by ourselves? We need the assistance of his grace. So that must mean nature has its own sort of end that then grace can elevate us toward the supernatural end. So anyway, we'll call it the natural and the supernatural ends. He says acquired virtue is ordered toward a natural end of human fulfillment, human flourishing. What is it that we can attain on our own? Even that we can kind of put in quotes. Sure. And then the supernatural end would be the beatific vision, union with God, which we can only attain with the help of habitual sanctifying grace.
Right.
So acquired would be toward the natural end, infused virtue towards the supernatural. We could also say the method of attainment. So acquired virtue is attained by my concerted effort, my repeated activity, developing a habit over time, whereas infused virtue comes by grace. So a baptized infant possesses infused virtue, although they're not able to exercise it yet. not until they get to the age of reason. Now, that's the distinction Aquinas makes, but there's all these debates over, well, clearly, even with grace isn't possessing you. God doesn't take control of you. You still have your agency. So can I also work toward infused virtue? Does the Christian have both acquired and infused virtue? Do they only have infused virtue? Sometimes even they ask, what about the non-Christian, the pagan? Can they only have acquired virtue, or can grace be at play for them? So there's a lot of different opinions there. Yeah.
So for those who maybe have have a very rudimentary, understanding, can you just run through sort of a taxonomy? Everyone has heard of the four cardinal virtues,
oh, sure.
right? So can you sort of map it out for us?
Yeah, sure. So among those acquired or infused, whichever we go with, we would say there's 7 classical virtues. You've got the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological. The 3 theological come from Scripture. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We have the ode, that hymn to love, which is really agape in Greek, but caritas in Latin.
Right.
So that's where we get charity, not just giving money to people, right? Charity is the love of God and neighbor. So we get faith, hope, and charity mentioned there. The cardinal virtues are also mentioned in the Old Testament. Depending on which ancient philosopher, they'll give you different lists of the cardinal virtues, but really the tradition is centered around prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. The reason being, again, if we go back to Aquinas, he says that as a human person, we have the different acts that we perform. We have the habits that are formed by those acts, but those habits are really shaping these capacities that we have. He calls them powers or potentialities. And there's many different capacities that we have. We think of our intellect and will, but there's so many more, like our 5 senses, our emotions, our ability to just digest food and have nutrition and grow and reproduce, and many different capacities.
Right.
But we don't have control over most of them. I can't will better sight. Otherwise, I wouldn't be wearing these glasses.
I can't will more hair.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not going to happen.
Can't will to be a little taller.
Sure.
To not have indigestion, right?
Right,
Indirectly, you can affect those things.
Yeah, sure.
But not directly. But there are 4 capacities that we do have this more direct control over. Our intellect, the way we think, what we think about, whether what we think is correct or not. Our will, our power of free choice. Do we choose good or evil? How well do we choose those things? And then he says there's 2 different capacities that deal with our emotions. He calls them passions. There's certain passions we experience all the time based off of the things that we sense. And then others that are, we only experience them in matters of difficulty or challenge. But basically, you have those 4 powers, and he says, well, they can be habituated. You can use those powers for good or for evil, against your nature or for your nature, and you can do that in better or worse ways. Right. So prudence perfects the intellect. That's what we think of as practical wisdom, the ability to discern what is the virtuous act, but not just figure out what it is, because that could be just abstract knowledge of ethics. It's important for prudence that it's also commanding the will to actually do it. So somebody who knows what they should do but doesn't follow through with it, they're not prudent. You have to know what the good is, but then also perform it. And then justice perfects the will. That's about what do I owe to other people. And then fortitude and temperance perfect our emotional responses to things, basically making sure that we're not drawn away from the good because of all the different pleasures and goods in this life, and that we also stand firmly in the good in the midst of trial. Because sometimes we're pursuing the good, but then we give up too easily. Right. Or we don't know when to back down.
Yeah. Well, and so your focus is on these cardinal virtues. Mm-hmm. Sometimes in other literature, you'll come across things like the intellectual virtues.
Sure.
And so prudence seems to be partly that, sort of seeing things as they are, but also, as you pointed out, I think, commanding that it be done, if you will. What is the relationship? Do you consider the intellectual virtues to be real virtues? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, prudence is a fascinating virtue because it has that overlap and all the different hats that it wears, as it were. Yeah. But Aquinas does make that distinction, intellectual and moral virtue. He would say that intellectual virtues perfect our intellect. It's the good use of our intellect, but it's not about good and evil. It's about truth. So how well do we conform to the truth? So the intellectual virtues for him can also have vices opposed to them. The moral virtues, we hear a lot about, being impatient or getting too angry or being unjust. But the intellectual virtues can have vices as well, but they wouldn't be like going beyond what is good or falling short of what's good. It would be more like affirming what is false or denying what is true.
Right.
And Aquinas lists 5. He says there's wisdom, understanding, knowledge, prudence, and then sometimes it's the Latin word is ars, Greek would be techne. Sometimes people
Yeah,
call it
art.
skill. They call
Yeah.
it art. Right? Those different things.
Yeah.
Now, what's the relationship between them and the moral virtues? The moral virtues perfect our appetites, the will, our emotions, all the appetites that draw us toward what is good. There's some funny dynamics there. On the one hand, you don't need intellectual virtue for moral virtue because intellectual virtue, it doesn't make you good.
Right.
It gives you the facility for being good, but not the right use of that facility. So I always draw an example of the mad scientist.
Right.
The mad scientist has all this knowledge of chemistry and biology, but just doesn't use it for good. And if we call him a mad scientist, he's probably using it for evil, right?
Right.
So just because you have that knowledge doesn't make you a good person. And in fact, we probably know, well, that's always the right.
That's a little close
As
to
professors, we need to
Right.
make sure that we don't become these just arrogant,
Right.
eggheads dictating what should be done and
and not following our own
thinking we
guidance.
always know what's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So on the one hand, intellectual virtue doesn't make you good, and so you don't need intellectual virtue for moral virtue except for prudence. But on the other hand, the more you know, the more opportunities you'll have for doing good things.
Right.
So if I can be prudent about the way I just carry myself as a person, but if I don't understand medicine, I can't make prudential decisions in the medical field. Right? The best I can do is defer to people who have that knowledge.
Right.
So there's some overlap, but
Right.
really the intellectual virtue can open up the horizons for ways that I can be good.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Well, I'm going to ask a question. This is a not a very deep rabbit hole, but we'll go down. So, the distinction between curiositas and studiositas, as people who are involved in the intellectual life, the idea that there's an ordered pursuit of knowledge, studiositas, and then there's this vice, curiositas.
Yeah.
I mean, that was fascinating and very convicting when I first heard about this. And the internet actually seems to sort of breed curiositas because you just keep clicking on things and it's that looks interesting. And yet curiosity, its English cognate, is it's a cute little monkey, Curious George, right? And so there's curiosity is cultivated and praised. Can you say a bit about those two kind of smaller things?
Oh yeah, sure. And I should have mentioned that the cardinal virtues, they're called cardinal because they're like the hinges for the moral life, but there are many other virtues. Aquinas would just put them under those virtues.
Sure,
They're greater specifications. So studiositas, he puts underneath the virtue of temperance. So temperance typically is about restraining. Fortitude encourages us toward the good. Temperance kind of restrains us from going too far. So there's a certain restraint that we need in study.
Right.
Sometimes I think we need to be encouraged to study more, right? But there can be, this virtue of studiositas, but also this vice of curiositas. And so we think of Curious George, we say curiosity killed the cat.
Right.
So we do recognize at some level that curiosity can be bad. I think it's one of the continuous problems with translations is the English language and the way that words shape over time. We already mentioned charity gets reduced to just giving money.
Right.
Here we have another one. So curiosity, we usually think of it as a good thing. We encourage our students to be curious, ask questions, questions-centered pedagogy, and all things like that. But Aquinas says there's many ways that we can go wrong. So we want to pursue truth. We want to pursue study, especially as a theology professor, for example. I should be studying theology and coming to know that so that I can articulate it and convey that knowledge. But there are different ways that I could be curious as a vice. Some of them being that, and it's not bad to have hobbies, but if I am interested in sports statistics, for example, and I spend all my time memorizing those stats, again, nothing wrong. That's a good to enjoy sports and all that. But if I'm spending so much time memorizing sports statistics that I'm not studying theology, so when I'm teaching class, I'm forgetting what it is that I'm supposed to say or what the connections are. I can't answer students' questions. And at that point, I've become too curious about the sports statistics. I'm neglecting a duty that I have. I didn't have the right self-restraint so that I can fulfill the duties of justice that I have.
Right, yeah.
Or he says sometimes it could just be by what we're interested in. The occult would be a great example.
Right.
So certain priests are commissioned to be exorcists, and they should learn the ins and outs of that so they can do their job well.
Right.
Now, again, it's not bad to be somewhat curious about exorcisms. There are books on it. There are podcasts on it. But to go to the extent where you're really going into these more occult books and figuring out what these spells are and things like that, it's not for us.
Right.
It can go too far. Maybe one of the more common examples would be, biblically we think of knowledge. It says, Adam knew his wife, and it goes to the area of sexual experience of sexual knowledge. And, adultery is a sort of a form of curiosity. You're learning that which you shouldn't know about another person. It's not your spouse. So that can bring us into the domain of chastity and pornography and things like that, where this is knowledge you shouldn't have.
Right.
In fact, Augustine, here we are thinking, oh, curiosity, that's a good thing. How could that be a vice? Augustine puts it as one of the three biggest vices. When he looks at Jesus' temptations in Scripture, the devil tempts him to what? To turn the stones into bread, and to jump off the temple, let the angels catch you, and then to fall down, worship the devil, and reign over all the kingdoms of the world. Well, he says that why these three? There's so many different interpretations of why these three, but one of the ones Augustine gives is that, well, these are the three biggest things that we're tempted to. And so Christ needs to redeem all that we suffer. And so he says specifically the one where he's tempted to jump off the temple, that's a spectacle, right? It's very bombastic. Or even like a testing God, like, will you catch me? That's curiositas for Augustine. He says it's one of the three biggest vices that we're tempted toward.
Yeah.
We have this natural inclination to know truth, so we just want to know, but we're not always directing it toward the right things.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned the internet exacerbating this.
Yeah.
I mean, I know when you're in an election cycle or for a war, it's easy to stop working on this hard lecture that I'm writing or, investigation and just see what's happening. And it's what I'm wanting other kinds of knowledge. I'm wanting knowledge about, are we at war or, who's winning the election? But that's actually, I need to be focused on, so it's something that I think our current technology tends to exacerbate. But you can justify is because you're getting knowledge. Yep. But it's disordered and chaotic. Yeah. So I'm sure no one else out there has any trouble, with that kind of thing. I want to speak more broadly about the insights that you offer in your book. But one of the things that I think you've mentioned that's been of great interest to people that I find interesting, having read your book, is the interconnectedness of the virtues. So you can either sort of walk us through the highlights of your study, or you can start there, and then we can go from there to the others. But can you say a bit about this interconnectedness?
Sure. Yeah, this is a game changer when I discovered it in Aquinas. It kind of he has these two questions in the Summa Theologiae on the connectivity of the virtues and the equality of the virtues, and just kind of reading it, seeing like, oh yeah, okay, they're connected. This is how it could work. What I didn't realize was that I don't know. I guess it's a little more implicit than I thought it was. And the feedback I've gotten on the book is that everyone loves that chapter. This is the most useful strategy because I think intuitively what we're taught is if you have a vice or if you lack a certain virtue, right? If you have a vice, work on the opposite virtue, or if you lack a virtue, that's the virtue you need to work on. But the whole problem is that we're bad at it. So I guess there's a lot of room for improvement, but if you're bad at something, how do you get better at it? Well, you practice, but if you practice incorrectly, you're not going to get any better. In fact, it might get worse because now you just develop bad habits. Yeah. So the whole idea with Aquinas here, and this is actually to go back to something you said before about these different virtue theories. For Plato and Augustine, they would say the virtues are united. That the virtues are really just one. So for Plato, it's knowledge. Right. And so you either know or you don't. And if you're not acting temperately, well, it's because you don't have the right knowledge. Right. That's not true for Aristotle and Aquinas. He thinks the virtues are these different perfections of our human character or human nature, but they are certainly connected. Right. And just take a step back to look at a big picture. Why? Because virtue is the full flourishing of a human life, the true excellence of human life. So virtue integrates us. It brings together our intellect and our will and our passions. They're all working in harmony toward one end. Where vice disintegrates us. It pulls us apart. We're at war with ourselves. We don't understand why we're doing what we do. We experience regret. And we see in Genesis 3 what bears out. Because the soul becomes disintegrated, now the body is going to disintegrate, right? And we're going to die. So anyway, the virtues are connected. So the idea then being that anytime you work on one virtue, it's going to affect your other habits as well. Insofar as I'm just, I'm also acting temperately and courageously and prudently. Right. So we can use this to our advantage. If we find that we struggle with a particular virtue and growing in it is difficult for us, well, why not turn that on its head? Let me work on the virtues I'm already good at and just perfect them all the more. And as that virtue increases, it's going to bring the weaker virtues along with it. No. And that can work across virtues, but even within a virtue, at different aspects of the virtue. Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, and maybe this will be a way to bring in other themes from your book, but
Somebody from the outside can look at this and say, "Oh, this is just a form of Pelagianism. We're just, this is just a Catholic version of self-improvement plan."
Mm-hmm.
How do you? How is it different? And maybe grace is a key concept here. So, can you say a bit about that? How is this just different from a self-improvement, self-help program?
Sure. Yeah, certainly grace is going to be the big answer there, but I think we can even say more in the sense that, self-help, there's certainly, there's a place for that. And, books that can more broadly, in the secular world kind of reach to different people. Now, I think what we're saying here, because it's about human nature, it does apply to everyone. So it's not dependent on a Christian worldview. It's either true or it's not. But even then, I would say, what we're saying can go a little bit further with, there can be a tendency with self-help sometimes to be subjective in the sense that kind of you determine what your weaknesses and your faults are. You determine how it is that you get better. This, I believe, is an objective approach to it. We're looking at human nature itself, and what's true of one human is going to be true of all humans. Now, obviously, in the particularities, there will be differences.
Sure.
And so there's room for that subjective element. But this is perennial. This is timeless.
Right.
Aquinas, on some level, right, isn't saying anything new from the ancients. He's putting it in a new framework. He's articulating a new way. Although he is then going beyond it and saying something new, because we do have the life of grace. We have the Christian truth. We have the incarnation, right? The incarnation changes everything. So what we have to acknowledge is that, I'm doing my best to grow in virtue, but how do I even know what virtue is? How do I know what does justice actually look like?
Right.
And so a lot of growth in virtue has to do with looking towards virtuous people and really that imitation. This theme of imitation that we find again and again, beauty being a form of imitation, the moral life being beautiful. So we've got this imitation of the virtuous person. What should I do? Well, we're comfortable with rules because they're black and white.
Right.
Okay, don't do this, do this. But sometimes there's no legislation there, and we say, well, what should I do? And the answer is, well, do what the virtuous person would do. Yeah. Wow, okay, so virtue can be frustrating because we want that black and white. That's what's comfortable for us. We have to go outside of ourselves, and we imitate the virtuous person. Thankfully, in the church, we've got the saints. We've got this whole, right, if you ever see a dictionary of saints, where you got all these different people who did it. They made it, so we can connect with one of them to imitate them. Ultimately, they're all imitating Christ, which is why it's worth imitating them at all.
Yeah.
But that kind of brings it all back, doesn't it? So why did the saints achieve virtue? Is because they were imitating Christ, who is virtue incarnate. And so they are focused on Christ in all their different walks of life and their different vocations, the way in which they did it. But they're only able to do it because Christ was formed in them, because the Holy Spirit dwelt within them, and wherever the Holy Spirit, the Father, and the Son are as well. So by the sacrament of baptism, they're made temples of the Most Holy Trinity, and grace, uncreated grace, dwells within them, so that now this created grace can work in them to help them begin a good work and to accompany them in their good works and complete those good works. So we can't ignore the life of grace. And while I say there's 7 different strategies in here, some of them can be employed simultaneously, and many of them should be. And one of them being, we should always be praying. We have this tendency to treat God almost like other people. So when it comes to like human politeness, you ask somebody for a favor, and they're like, well, okay, I can help you, but like, did you even try yourself yet? And so human politeness dictates that you do what you can first, and only then do you go and ask for other people for help. So we sometimes project that onto God, and it's like, okay, well, I don't want to trouble God too much. So
God helps those who help themselves.
Yeah, exactly. So let me do what I can first, and then I'll ask for him. And by then it may be too late. Really, God's not. He's infinite. He's outside of time, and he wants to help us. Right? He's invested in us, and so we should ask for his help first, and also while we're doing it, and also thank him after. Yeah. Whether it turned out good or bad, he can bring good out of the evil. So it's always worth thanking him after. Yeah.
This is going. This relates to the question that's a minute ago, which you've given a really thorough answer to. There is, I still think, a high level of interest in Stoicism.
Sure.
Online, particularly among young men. You could argue that a lot of the attraction of Jordan Peterson's work is it's a form of Stoicism in a lot of ways. How would you distinguish your strategies from what is sort of the current vogue of Stoicism?
Sure, and yeah, the current vogue of Stoicism, and there's many different forms of Stoicism. Many different saints have been quite stoic, and even some of the things that they say. So even in Christianity, I think we can abide by some Stoicism. But you think of, sometimes closely related to Stoicism is altruism. This idea of you just do the good because it's the good, not because you get anything out of it. And when we read Aquinas on virtue, we might start scratching our heads because we say, well, hold on a second. He says the hallmarks of virtue are to act with ease and promptness, but also enjoyment.
Right.
And so, wait a minute, if I'm doing the good thing because it's pleasurable or because, it makes me happy. Sometimes we use this word happy all the time.
Right.
Eudaimonia, the good life, the happy life. What do we mean by happy there? We can get suspicious of it. Should I be happy? Should I be enjoying this? Or should it be a preferred indifferent? As the Stoics might say.
Yeah,
exactly.
Exactly.
And I think that we'd be ignoring our nature to
Right.
say that you can't be. We're hardwired for this. God made us for the good. Virtue is its own reward. We hear that. We think of it as a platitude, but it really is. Like there's something about the way we're wired as human beings. We're made for the good. So when we're pursuing that good and when we achieve it, it feels good because now we're living as we ought.
Yeah.
In fact, we're experiencing being more than we would otherwise. And that's very metaphysical, but if God's goodness and God's being,
Right.
then there's some correlation between them. We call them transcendentals, but being itself is good, and we can distinguish ontological and moral goodness. But on some level, we can say the better we are, the more we choose the good, the more we are, the more being we have.
Right.
And when we think of the gospel, Christ says, "I've come to give you life and to give it abundantly."
Right.
He wants us to be more human. This is why not only does he want to redeem our nature, he wants to elevate our nature. And as St. Peter says in his second letter, that we're made to become partakers of the divine nature, that it's not enough for us to be fully human. He wants us to be godly as well.
Right.
And God is being itself.
Yeah. Yeah. This is good. So I think, thankfully you've created this course that our listeners can watch. Got your book, people can read. Are there any other sort of parting words you want to offer, advice for people who say, hey, yes, I want to pursue this? Do you have any sort of parting ideas?
Don't give up.
Yeah.
Right. Some of the most worthwhile things in life are also difficult. The virtuous life is difficult. So don't be discouraged. Sometimes we look at the saints and we think, oh, they're so distant from us.
Right.
Imitate Christ. Oh, great. Well, he was God. Or imitate Mary. Oh, she was without sin. But we can do it, right? God wants it for us. And the thing to keep in mind is God's more patient with us than we are with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And actually, even St. Thomas, maybe it's worth ending on this note of patience. Because patience is such a difficult virtue. Sometimes we joke, it's kind of a rookie mistake to pray for patience because God's going to answer that prayer. And yeah. No, but really, Aquinas says that he has this question, can you have patience without grace? And it's something interesting. Why would he even ask that question? Now, it's coming out of St. Paul's hymn where he says, love is patient. That's the very first thing he says about it. But the more I've reflected on patience, and who am I patient with and who am I impatient with, you think, well, we're more patient with the things that we love. Now, that doesn't always seem to be the case because sometimes we think we're less patient with our family members than we are with anybody else. So I think maybe there's like two levels to it. But even among our family members, we're probably more patient with the ones we love more than the ones that we don't. So I want to be virtuous, and I want to be virtuous now, but I'm not virtuous now. God, why don't you make me virtuous now? Don't you want me to be virtuous? We have these thoughts run through our mind. And God's patient with us. We need to be patient with ourselves, but that's also a form of self-love, right? We need to love God and also love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So I think in asking God for true patience, not just patience with others, but patience with ourselves, the saint is the person who doesn't quit, right? The saint is the person who keeps trying, that keeps cooperating with God's grace and saying, look, I messed up, but please forgive me. I want to try again. So we ask for that patience. We never give up, and that's the best strategy.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you
for all that you do at the college and for your course and this book. And I always learn a great deal speaking with you. All right.
Thanks so much. It was enjoyable. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Christendom Conversations. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. To learn more about Christendom College and its mission, visit us at christendom.edu. Until next time, may we all continue to seek the truth, live the faith, and restore all things in Christ. God bless.